Thank you. Hello again, and Happy New Year to everybody. It's close enough that I can get away with it without a wish as well. You'll know me from the presentation, as Scott has already said, about the first book, Spitfire Luck. This is my second book. I'm not the author of this. I'm author of part of it. I am actually the editor of this. So it's a collection of stories, which I'll explain in a moment. The book came from a very different place than the first book that was this one that I spoke about earlier. After working on this one, I was focused for a long time on fighter command and the dashing fighter pilots, obviously in the context of my father's experiences. I found myself reading more about Bomber Command. I'd read stories about it before, but didn't know very much about it. And as I got deeper and deeper into the individual stories, it really put me in awe of the commitment and courage of the young men who faced a completely different kind of war to the dashing fighter pilots. These young guys got into aircraft in the evening, flew in the dark through often dreadful weather, over enemy territory, facing flak, marauding night fighters that were far more maneuverable and more heavily armed than they were in defense. And more importantly, doing it night after night after night. And that's something I still can't completely get my head around. It's quite an extraordinary experience. I felt that they had powerful stories that needed to be told, as much as my father's did, and with all due respect to him. And not all of these young bomber crews had been able to tell their stories. So it happened that my publisher of the original version of Spitfire Luck in the UK had also published a series of stories on Bomber Command. They were in the failed to return theme. They were centered around several significant actions, campaigns of Bomber Command, the Dambusters raid, the D-Day preparatory raids, the V weapons bombing raids, and so on. And Steve mentioned to me that in many of those stories, the crews featured Canadian flyers or individuals, and he, after some discussion with him, we thought it might be a good idea to put some of those stories together and make them more accessible to Canadians, since the original Failed to Return series was only available in the UK. So that was the basis of this project. At the same time, I was working as a volunteer at the BC Aviation Museum. I still am. And I came across a little-known story of a fellow named Teddy Blenkinsop. The name may be familiar to you, having driven out through the valley there on Blenkinsop Road, the local family. And that's him on the cover of the book. He was an interesting fellow, and I did some research on him and added a chapter on his experiences into the book. And this logbook here that you see parts of with the word missing is actually the last page of his logbook, currently held in the BC archives. The other thing that fascinated me about the stories that I poured through as we were thinking about putting this book together was I started wondering where these guys got their training, where they came from. Well, it turns out that every one of the young men in this book, without exception, had been the product of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, BCATP. This was important to me because the more I read about the BCATP as well, the clearer it became how significant a part that program played in Canada's history, as well as specifically in the history of the RCAF and in the development of Canada as a nation. So I worked on the introduction to provide context, and I worked on Teddy's story. And those are my additions to to the specifics of the other stories that you find in here. I did spend a lot of time looking at these individual stories, and in fact took them a bit farther than the original authors had in many cases. I got in touch with families, we collected additional pictures, got more background to provide the Canadian context, and every one of them was as interesting as every other one. So the BCATP is an interesting start. The introduction was meant to give a kind of context that you could anchor the individual stories in. The BCATP was fascinating to me because as the program took shape, Prime Minister Mackenzie King had insisted that it be fully under the control of Canada. He went farther and offered to fund it completely. It was a decision which significantly buttressed the position of the country in terms of perception of its contribution to the war, and really established Canada as a country, as a major contributor. It was no small challenge to create. At the start of the war, the RCAF had about 235 pilots, 235, flying 270 string bag, outdated airplanes. It was no surprise that they were only supported by a few thousand regular and reserve members, and the difference between that situation at the beginning of the war and what was required to put into place the BCATP was the product of an enormous effort on the part of Canada. The BCATP itself required 3,500 odd training aircraft, training only. This doesn't count the regular RCAF combat aircraft. Had to be purchased just for training over a couple of years. Many had to be imported from the US using sometimes imaginative workarounds to the US legislation that prohibited provision of war material to belligerent nations, of which Canada was considered one. So they did things like some of the trainers. They had Yale trainers, which are sort of like an early version of the Harvard, that they brought up from California, and they would take them to places like Sweetgrass, Montana, where the neighboring community, the Alberta community, Coots, across the border, shared a runway with Sweetgrass, and the runway ran due east-west with the 49th parallel right dead center. So the Americans would come up and land the airplane on the runway, and the Canadian guy would replace the American pilot and fly it off to wherever it was intended to be. So they had many schemes like that they actually implemented. Another thing, they built more than 231 training facilities as part of this program, and that included 121 aerodromes, 80 of which were brand new, fully functioning, operational flight training centers with the standard triangular runway layout, all the necessary infrastructure, hangars and so on. And all of that was constructed in 3 years. Just imagine any military procurement these days taking that amount of time. And imagine growing from 5,000 people at the beginning of the war to 215,000 odd people in uniform in the RCAF, trained and operational over 5 years. Extraordinary achievement. So the success of the program was noteworthy. There were 131,553 men trained at a cost of $2.2 billion in 1945 dollars. 1.6 billion of that was paid by Canada, was covered by Canada. And that's about $28 billion in today's money. Of the 131,000, there were 73,000 Canadians who went through the program, 36,500 from the UK, 5,500 nearly from other countries that had been invaded by the Germans and whose citizens had left and wanted to fight. Poles, Norwegians, Free French, Czechs, Dutch, Belgians. And the balance were from the rest of the Commonwealth, all over the Commonwealth. Of those 73,000 men, 40 Canadian men, 40,000 odd served in Bomber Command, 40,000, and 10,000 of those men did not come back. So, the book obviously just is trying to be representative of the experience of these people. These are some of the young men the book's about. And you can take a guess from looking at the photos where these young fellows were in their training programs or their operational programs. Young guys down in the bottom here with the white wedgie, or the white, basically ab initio markers in their wedgie caps. You've got people like the young fellow in the flight suit who's just graduated and is ready to go, confident, and you've got a couple of guys here who clearly obviously had some experience already and knew what they were in for. The top fellow, I'll talk a bit more about, John Fraser. He was a Vancouver Island native. So some of the men in this group flew with number 6 group in Bomber Command. That was a Canadian group. Many of them flew with various RAF squadrons, and the crews were mixed, thoroughly mixed throughout the war. Even in the Canadian Bomber Command, they were mixed crews, RCAF and RAF and other nationalities. A few of the RCAF fellows weren't even Canadians at all. They were Americans who had come up at the beginning of the war, or as the war went on, before the U.S. joined the war after Pearl Harbor, and did their training. They wanted to fly. They couldn't fly in the States, and they wanted to fly in wartime, and decided to join the RCAF and went through the BCATP training program. Of the young men who populate this book, not that many survived. Some did. This is a picture of Jack Bromfeld and Hauptmann Heinz Röcker, taken in 2004. Jack was a member of a 7-person crew of a Halifax Q for Queenie that was shot down by Röcker, who maneuvered his Junkers 88 with the upward firing cannon under their aircraft, pressed the firing button and riddled the aircraft and severed all the control linkages. So fortunately, all 7 members of Jack's crew got out of the airplane, managed to parachute out. One RAF member of the crew was actually killed a couple of days later when he tried to escape. But the rest spent the remainder of the war in POW camp. And then 60 years after the war ended, Jack, who was the radio operator, met Heinz Röcker, who was the guy who shot him down, courtesy of the author of Jack's story who put them together. The author said when they met each other, they just got on like a house on fire. They couldn't stop talking to each other. And Bromfield's Halifax, interestingly, was Röcker's one of his 2 victories that night, his 47th and 48th. This was a guy who knew his business. As I said, I was especially fascinated by the story of Teddy Blankenship, who's a Victorian native. His story I don't think is very well known. There is a good book about it, but it's written by a Belgian fellow and published in England, and I don't think is very, very familiar to most people here. It's worth reading. I was able to make a close connection. I read the book and talked with the author. I was able to make a close connection when I went to the archives at BC where Teddy's logbook and photos and a number of other family-related things are held in the archives. His mother apparently was a volunteer there and bequeathed Teddy's records to the archives. And actually, handling original material is different from handling copies, photocopies or something. I know this from my work at the museum. The logbooks, even a beautiful full color glossy copy of a logbook page is not the same as looking at the ink that the guy wrote his records on. So that was a tremendous advantage for me. It gives a particular weight to the stories for me as a writer. I was also lucky to speak with his cousin, a fellow by the name of Brigadier General John Naroutsos, who is in a home in Sydney now. John's focus on Teddy was his leadership qualities. John was younger than Teddy, but remembers him very well from his early days in Victoria. And from what I learned about Teddy, he always seemed to be what might be called a straight arrow. Somebody who's serious personality, capable, thoughtful, committed to doing the best he could. He really looks it, doesn't he? In that photo. Anyway, he did a pretty typical training program. This is where he started at number 8 Elementary Flying Training School in Sea Island, what is now Vancouver International. He had submitted his aircrew application early in the war, and they put him on hold for a year. I'm not quite sure why. That seemed rather strange to me, but he was finally inducted and sent to Sea Island for his basic training. Went on to do, he passed near the top of his program. He went on to do advanced training, and he made the choice of opting for multi-engine training. Multi-engine training obviously led to bomber responsibilities. Most of his classmates would have dreamt of becoming the dashing fighter pilots, but in a letter home, Teddy said he did well on aerobatics, but, quote, far better on instruments. Besides, he said, these fighter planes are too damned uncomfortable, and anyway, I black out easily. So there's a young man who obviously knew his limitations and where his strengths were. So he went on to sail through multi-engine training and unusually qualified as both a navigator and a pilot. In fact, he did well enough with the navigation to be dragooned into becoming an instructor at Rivers, Manitoba, one of the coldest places in the globe. From Rivers, he was sent on to New Brunswick to set up an astronavigation school at Penfield, and then he was posted to New Zealand, of all places, to help that country's Air Force set up its own training systems. So it's quite a testament to his skill and knowledge. When he left New Zealand in 1942, he had enough of instructing and pleaded to be sent overseas. So the powers that be agreed to that, put him in training on Wellingtons, and he was assigned to number 425 Alouette Squadron in North Africa, in Tunisia. 425 is still an active squadron, for those who know. It's in Bagotville, flying CF-18s, a little different from the Wellington. Anyway, in his North Africa tour, he was proficient enough that he ended up being appointed the deputy flight commander of the squadron and became what they call the target illuminator, which is kind of an early Pathfinder role. At the end of his tour, Teddy returned to England, and in October 1943, he volunteered for a second tour. I think at that point they were offering second tours as a way of completing your obligation to the military. If you took a break, they would send you off to as an instructor or something like that, and then eventually you would end up on a second tour, at which time you could go home. After which time you could go home. But Teddy and many others decided they just wanted to go right through with the 2 tours. So he volunteered for a second. He was trained on Lancasters and promptly transferred to 405 Pathfinder Squadron, RCAF, led by then the highly respected Wing Commander and later Lieutenant General Reg Lane, whose name is probably familiar to many of you. He died here in Victoria, I think in 2010 or something like that. Anyway, once again, Teddy and his crew shone in their work. Teddy was awarded the DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, in 1944 April. His crew's exemplary record was recognized when Reg Lane made him the Deputy Master Bomber for the squadron and in effect, Reg Lane's successor. So this was Teddy's crew on Lancaster S for Sugar when they took off from Granston Lodge on a raid to Monson on April 27th. And I'd like to read you this painting, by the way, is by John Rutherford. It's held at the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton, Alberta, and it is representative of the action that night over Monson.
Forgive me, this is 1943, is it?
1944. Yeah. So, as they arrived for lunch on April 27th, 1944, the Blenkinsop crew were informed that Larry Allen, who was the navigator, had been awarded the DFC, the third in the crew. They also discovered that they were on the duty roster for that night in their customary aircraft, S for Sugar, leading a secondary raid over Monson as a backup to Wing Commander Reg Lane, the designated Master Bomber. For Teddy and most of his crewmates, it was their 40th operation over enemy territory. Teddy and his crew took off from Granston Lodge 1 minute after midnight, and with Wing Commander Lane, they made it to the target unmolested, began to set out the visual bombing markers. The main force bomber stream arrived shortly after, heavily harassed by enemy night fighters, flak, and the ever-probing search raids. Lane continued to provide direction through the raid to ensure the needed accuracy, resulting in significant damage to the Monson rail yards. As the attack ended around 01:45, Lane directed Teddy and his crew to return to base, mission accomplished, and Lane's crew turned to follow shortly thereafter. At the end of the returning bomber stream, Lane witnessed several aircraft shot out of the sky by the marauding night fighters, mostly employing the deadly Schräge Musik upward-firing cannon that allowed the attackers to close in below their victims without being seen. About 20 minutes after turning away from the target, he saw a massive explosion some 10 miles ahead, with colored pyrotechnic markers filling the sky. I knew immediately that was Teddy Blenkinsop's aircraft, Lane said, as we were the only 2 bombers carrying those specific colors. And judging from the size of the explosion, I reported that there was absolutely no chance of any survivors. So pending formal confirmation of this assessment, Teddy and his crew were listed as missing. As the first shells pounded through the aircraft from below and the bomber's remaining payload began to ignite, Teddy put the nose down and tried to keep his doomed aircraft stable. At about 300 feet, S for Sugar finally exploded and disintegrated. Only 3 of the crew seemed to have been able to leave the blazing wreck at low altitude. The first of the crew recovered had jumped without parachute, with the inevitable result. The second came down very close to the final point of impact and was later reported by local witnesses to have survived the low-level exit with serious injuries, only to be shot by his captors. The third was George Smith, who was picked up, also seriously injured, by the local Black Shirts, the Nazi collaborator organizations, and taken to a German hospital in nearby Diest. An RCAF War Crimes Investigation Unit later determined that he had been, quote, locked up in a room, denied medical attention, food, and drink for 3 days, and subsequently died from his injuries. The bulk of the wreckage and the balance of the crew, with the exception of Teddy, came down just west of the town of Vibecum in Belgium. The locals, who were not associated with the Black Shirts, were respectful and sympathetic in dealing with the fallen airmen. The casualties were laid in state in the parish hall and later buried in the town churchyard. Unaware of the circumstances of the rest of his crew, Teddy regained consciousness on the ground near his open parachute. Miraculously, he had been blown clear as the Lancaster's fuselage had come apart in the final explosion. His parachute somehow had opened in time to break his fall. His whole body hurt, and he had lost his boots, but he found himself more or less intact. The commotion of enemy search parties and dogs soon motivated him to distance himself from the burning remains of his aircraft. He almost immediately ran into a sympathetic couple who gave him some water, farmer's clothes, a pair of clogs, and then led him to a nearby wood. Determined not to be caught, Teddy decided to strike out on his own, heading south until exhaustion overcame him, and hungry, cold, and in need of medical help for a painful shoulder injury, he fell asleep in a haystack. There he was discovered by another farmer, who gave him food and water, and then contacted the local members of the resistance. By now, his parachute had been discovered, and the local forces knew there was an airman on the run. On enemy soil, Teddy now had to rely on the skills and daring of others. So that was the start of his lengthy adventure, perhaps not so lengthy. The resistance moved him around quite a bit, put him up with different families. One of the first was that of Hilaire Kamutz, and after changing places several times over the course of a few months, Teddy ended up in the home of the Famille Paipen, ostensibly hiding there as the boyfriend of the young woman, the eldest daughter, Paula, who actually seemed to have had some feelings for him and never did get married after the war by all reports. So Teddy was facing issues because he didn't have his uniform, because he had no military identification. When the Gestapo finally raided the town and shut down the resistance unit there by capturing most of the adult men, Teddy was one of the people that they swept up. Without his service identification, he was denied any recognition as a POW, and after a series of misadventures in captivity, he was eventually placed in a forced labor camp and finally incarcerated at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where, suffering from tuberculosis and malnutrition, he died of what the German records euphemistically referred to as heart failure, which was usually the result of a lethal injection. This was in January 1945. His body was cremated, and the ashes probably scattered for fertilizer along with those of thousands of others. And at that time, he was 24 years old, squadron leader in the RCAF. This is the churchyard in Vibecum on the top left, and you can see his 7 crewmates are all buried there. The cross on the right is a memorial, and you can see the lines of similar crosses in the back, and they are to the young men who were taken away by the Germans at the same time Teddy was taken away to the concentration camp, basically given the same treatment and also did not come back to their homes. Let me talk also about another fellow from originally from Nanaimo, John Fraser. He participated in the Dams raid as bomb aimer for Hoppy Hopgood's crew. I listened a couple of years back to his daughter, Sheer Lowe, tell his story. It's one she learned by accident. And how she became engaged with the history of her father is interesting. She ended up as a stewardess. I forget which airline she was flying with. But she was chatting with the pilots at some point. They were in flight, and they were talking about their understanding of and their admiration for some of the wartime aviators. And she said, "Well, I know my father flew during the war. I'm not sure what he did." And they said, "Well, what was his name?" She said, "John Fraser," and their jaws dropped because they both knew him. And knew his story and had a huge amount of respect for him. I'll read you a bit about his experience. He was in a Lancaster on the Dams raid. So this is on the way to attacking the Marina Dam. It began to go wrong over Dolman. Flak, which they had so far seen but avoided, this time caught up with them and inflicted serious damage. Tony, the rear gunner, smelled the unmistakable aroma of cordite in the aircraft and noted that the port outer engine had been hit and was on fire. He had also been hit himself, sustaining slight injuries to his stomach and groin. Others had not been so lucky. John Minchin, the wireless operator, had been more seriously hurt and could not move his legs. The skipper was hit and bleeding from a head wound, and there was no response to his captain's calls from George Gregory in the front turret. With one of his crew possibly dead, one seriously wounded, and one other with minor injuries, Hopgood would have had every justification in abandoning his mission. But he did not. In the best traditions of the RAF, and the desire to press on regardless, Hopgood remained steadfast to his task. M for Mother arrived at the Marina, and the three aircraft in the first flight, Gibson, Hopgood, and Martin, began orbiting the target. There were no balloons or searchlights to contend with, but every crew was mindful of the flak guns positioned on the dam and in the immediate vicinity. Gibson, Guy Gibson, who was the CO of the squadron, flew a dummy run before committing to the attack, reminding Hopgood to be ready to assume command should something happen. Then he went in and had the great satisfaction of seeing his bomb skip across the water toward the dam, followed by a terrific explosion and a great spurt of water leaping into the air. But the dam held. Hopgood had an anxious wait before his attack. The water needed to settle and the spray to clear. So M for Mother held off for a further 5 minutes before Gibson finally gave his deputy the order to attack, reassuring Hopgood that it was a piece of cake. It was to prove anything but. Gibson had the advantage of catching German flak batteries off guard, but by the time Hopgood came in for the attack, they were more than ready for him, and an almost predictable tragedy unfolded. Tony, the rear gunner, and John Fraser, who was the bombardier, were at the exact opposite ends of their aircraft. Tony was at the rear and could see nothing, save for the vicious streaks of tracer passing close by his turret. He prepared to shoot at the flak gunners once they were over the dam. John, on the other hand, had arguably the best seat in the house, but as he held the bomb sight in front of him and waited for the release point, the aircraft was hit and immediately burst into flames. The bomb was seen to release, but a fraction too late, and instead of hitting the wall of the dam, it skipped over the wall and exploded in a power station a little way beyond. A red Very flare was fired from the aircraft in accordance with instructions to indicate that the bomb had been dropped. but by now one wing was almost entirely enveloped in flames, and the aircraft appeared all but doomed. Hopgood desperately tried to gain height to give his crew a chance to bail out, and with only 2 engines still functioning, managed to struggle up to around 500 feet before the aircraft exploded and plunged burning to the ground. In the 30 seconds or so from the time that the aircraft cleared the dam to the moment it exploded, the activity within the aircraft had been frantic. Both pilot and flight engineer had tried desperately and against overwhelming odds to extinguish the flames before Hopgood gave in to the inevitable and shouted for the crew to bail out. John in the nose needed no second bidding and opened his escape hatch to see the tops of the trees uncomfortably close. Ignoring what he had been taught, he clipped on his parachute and pulled the ripcord inside the cockpit, letting the parachute billow out in front of him and pull him out after it. At the rear, Tony was faced with a similar dilemma. With the loss of hydraulics and therefore power, he'd been obliged to crank his turret around by hand in double quick time to get back into the fuselage and retrieve his parachute. With the usual escape route blocked, he too was obliged to ignore the manual and jump from the rear door. But as he was planning to leave the aircraft, he suddenly halted by the sight of was halted by the sight of the badly injured John Minchin edging his way down the fuselage toward him. Tony took the only decision he could and pushed Minchin out of the aircraft, pulling his D-ring as he went and hoping for the best. He then prepared to jump himself, also pulling his ripcord inside the aircraft, gathering the silk in his arms at the very moment that the aircraft exploded. Tony was blasted out through the entrance, suddenly and painfully understood why the crew entrance door was discouraged as his back struck the Lancaster's tail fin. As he tumbled out of the front hatch, John distinctly remembered seeing the tail wheel whizzing past his ear, and then within less than 2 or 3 seconds, hitting the ground. So, I mean, these, the things these guys went through in the name of serving their country, I think are just absolutely extraordinary. Anyway, John and Tony both ended up, Minchin unfortunately was so badly injured that he died. John and Tony both ended the war in Stalag 3. John ended up returning to Canada. I think Tony was an Australian and ended up back there. John came back with his young British bride to work on Vancouver Island. They had 2 boys named John and Guy, after Guy Gibson, and a daughter whom they named Shear, after Hoppy Hopgood's home in England. It was their tribute to the man that John Sr. thought had saved his life with his efforts to get the airplane up high enough they could bail out. So, these are all extraordinary stories, and each one of them is in its own right extraordinary. Working on the book, I had some personal recollections of the Lancaster, which features in many of the stories. My first one was walking with my father along the ramp, the flight line in Rockcliffe. We were on our way to go fishing, and at the time the RCAF had been enlisted to help map northern Canada, and these Lancasters had been converted to support that task. And they were all lined up, one after the other, and we were walking along in front of the lineup, and they just seemed enormous to me. I still remember the sense of how big these aircraft were. Even the tires were bigger than I was. And then more than 20 years later, my wife and I were gypsying around the East Coast in our Chipmunk that we owned at the time, when I had another encounter, this time with Edmundston's Gate Guardian. This is the airport at Edmundston, and they had this Lancaster parked there. I managed to clamber up inside, and once again I was absolutely struck by how big this aircraft was. And at this point I learned just how small it was from the point of view of the crew, and how difficult it would have been to get out of an airplane this size. It was a real eye-opener to me. Thinking back on that really served only to emphasize the commitment and bravery of the young men who got into these airplanes they knew were limited in their functionality night after night. I think it's very important to keep their stories alive, keep their memories alive, which is why we have this. So this airplane, by the way, is the one that's in Trenton right now, being restored by the RCAF Museum. As you've already learned, there's still pieces of a Lancaster up in Sydney in the museum, that's slowly being restored to show condition. Don't know whether it will when it will be finalized. It's a long project and a very expensive one, but they're determined to finish that. So that's the story. Thanks for your attention. As I say, it's been a pleasure to be here.
Just want to comment on the photograph you had of the crew in a local cemetery. We're all used to the big military cemeteries that are run by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. But when you travel in Europe, you'll find in a lot of cemeteries, small church cemeteries, 5, 6, 7 graves that are Commonwealth War graves. They're all Bomber Command pilots and crew. And so they're scattered all over Western Europe, even as far as the Czech Republic, etc. All places where Canadians belong. So I really encourage anyone who's traveling to Europe, traveling around, go to the Commonwealth War Grave site. It's not too hard to find a search of the places you want to be to find them in the cemetery, because they're all listed. But they're often forgotten because we don't think of it being all these hundreds of small cemeteries. So we try to find it.
Thank you.
If my hearing was correct, there were 40,000 Canadians in Bomber Command, of which 10,000 did not return.
That's right.
In addition to that, there must have been many casualties that in fact did return. Would you have a feel at all? Because the total of 10,000 plus several thousand casualties really eats up that 40,000.
I don't know the answer to that. One thing I will say, though, is that in a ground war, take Gaza or Tripoli or anything, it's usually 2.5, 3 times as many people as are killed that end up wounded. That was not the case with the Air Force, because in the ones that would have been wounded, in most cases went down with the ship. They were never recovered. Sometimes they were, but often not. So I think the ratio is probably quite a bit less. So, but I don't know an exact figure.
Thank you very much, Keith. Very poignant and thought-provoking. With your indulgence, perhaps I'll hold the floor for 60 seconds to tell you a little story. In 1991, I was in Wiltshire, in Western England, and I was cycling along a village path, and there was a gentleman standing there with a clipboard, well attired. It was in the aftermath of the British census, so I presumed he was a post-census enumerator. He hailed me, and I got down off the bicycle, and he asked me for a local address. I said, "I'm terribly sorry, I'm a near stranger here. I don't know the neighborhood well enough." He said, "What part of the United States are you from?" And I said, "Well, with respect, I'm a Canadian." He was terribly apologetic, as they almost always are. And he said, "Oh, I was in Canada during the war." And I said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Where were you in Canada?" He said, "Nova Scotia." And I said, by any remote stretch of the imagination, were you in Stanley, which was a tiny little airstrip outside Windsor, Nova Scotia, often used by Trans-Canada Airlines as an emergency landing spot if Shearwater were fogged in? And he said, yes, I was there at Stanley. And I said, what year? 1942, he said. And that was the year that my father was teaching flying in the Commonwealth Air Training Plant. So I thought I'd just add that as a little footnote to your thank you so much.
Great.
Bravo for an excellent presentation. Really riveting, and your ability to tie in local streets that we drive on, Blanchard, Lincolnshire, Nanaimo, suggests that you should consider writing for the Times Colonist or whoever a monthly op-ed to link this so important history of Canada to the locals. It'll be lost in time, and I definitely want to read your book, but really encourage taking that extra step.
Thank you.
My aunt married a New Zealander who was in the Commonwealth Air Training Plant, and he was killed learning to fly.
Learning to fly.
At the time, she had talked her way onto a merchant ship heading for New Zealand as the cook. And she arrived there to get the word that he had done. So she turned around eventually and cooked her way back to Canada.
That's one thing that I didn't talk about with the BCATP. You'll find the first story in this book is the loss of a training aircraft in Scotland. And there were huge numbers of people that were killed in training accidents for one reason or another. Sometimes just circumstances when they were learning in Canada. Sometimes when they went to England and found things totally different. I mean, no straight roads and fog and rain and all the rest, conditions they just weren't familiar with on the prairies in particular. So there are really significant losses leading up to the actual losses that were incurred in campaigns.
A footnote on a footnote. My father shared with me that one day he was in the control tower, and by some terrible, fatal error or incompetence, two pilots took off on colliding runways, rose into the air, and at 200 or 300 feet collided and crashed and burned, died. So a training accident right in front of him.
I had a couple of years ago, I had the great pleasure of going with a friend of mine to a number of museums in England, and one that particularly sticks in my memory is the one at Lincolnshire. I don't know if anybody knows about that one. They have a Lancaster that they used to taxi. They would take you out and taxi it up and down. They have a Mosquito as well, I think, that does that. But the Lancaster is now being restored to flight condition. It'll be the third in the world that's still maintained in flying order. But their museum I found not interesting for that airplane so much as for the fact that every nook and cranny in that museum had a display maybe the size of that table with pieces of airplane in them, and a full documentation of the circumstances and the names of the crew of the aircraft that was lost. And these were airplanes that were dug up from the fields around Lincolnshire. And they were discovered by farmers. In some cases they were pinpointed by research from the research society that's associated with the museum. But I thought this was a really fascinating tale, set of circumstances, and another way of preserving the memories of these men who either crashed on takeoff, crashed in training, crashed on return under difficult circumstances. So it was quite it's a very memorable kind of display. It's not as spectacular as a full-blown Lancaster, but it certainly is part of history.
Thank you. I think everybody knows that Pat Bay was one of the training aircraft, and some of you may know on Pender Island is a new park that's been established where I guess one of the training aircraft crashed, and with dedication to the pilot of it flying it. I also have a question. In these planes, there were a variety of ranks. You said that Blenkinsop was a squadron leader, I think, by the time he had died. What was the rank structure? Because I understand at one point some of the pilots were actually NCOs and others were officers. How did that happen? And by the end of the war, was everybody an officer who was a pilot, or how did it work?
Good question, and part of an ongoing fight that the RCAF and Canada had with the RAF. The RAF were, if you'll forgive the reference, thoroughgoing colonialists, and they regarded Canadians and everybody else from the colonies as basically second tier. When it got into the graduation from the BCATP pilots, as an example, the Canadian Air Force wanted to set a quota of officers for the top people in the training program, and I forget what the exact numbers were. Let's say it's 50%. The RAF said, "No way, we're not having half of these bums officers. We're going to have only 20% officers, and they'll be the ones that we recognize," and so on. So that discussion was a real point of contention for a long time between the two services. The Canadians said, "The heck with you, we're going to promote these people that we want to recognize," and the Brits were very upset about it for a long time. I mean, even Bomber Harris was one of the worst offenders. He was, for all the things that he contributed, he was very much a traditionalist and an elitist.
So one more personal story. My father was a Texan who came to Canada and flew for the RCAF. He was a flying officer. He flew Catalinas for a while, but when he was transferred to Ferry Command and met and married my mother in Montreal. But he was lost flying a B-25 from Montreal to the UK over the Atlantic in mid-February 1943.
Wow.
And there was an SOS and never heard from again. I mean, those guys flew completely stripped airplanes, every last bit of weight used up by fuel, but run into headwinds, and that's probably what happened, and it's all over.
And without any navigation or radio contact as
Yeah.
well. Yeah. No, it just the things they faced are just unfathomable.
A lot of the focus on Bomber Command fixates on the Lancaster.
Yeah.
A lot of Canadians flew Halifaxes and Wellingtons. Can
Mm-hmm.
you describe proportionally how that occurred?
I couldn't say unequivocally, but my strong suspicion is that the Canadians were probably given the RAF squadrons were probably given priority when the new, better equipment came out, and the Canadians and other squadrons were probably left with the equipment they had in terms of being replaced in sequence. Eventually, they all ended up pretty much with the Lancaster. There were those other, the Halifax not so much, but most of the other bombers that were extant at various points in the war ended up as training vehicles or serving other purposes with Coastal Command or that kind of thing. But the actual Bomber Command vehicles, aircraft, I think were systematically replaced with the Lancaster, which is why it gets so much press now.
Just one anecdote, though. The mention of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris. I actually have a photograph from Middleton, St. George, taken on the 31st of May, 1943. great things about the Canadian in Bomber Command as they were repatriating back to Canada. And I was born 9 months to the day after my father.
An early boomer.
I have a couple of questions that come out of some of the comments here. My mother was a war bride from Glasgow, an Army war bride. And I wasn't, and I've met dozens and dozens of war brides. But I was in my middle 20s before I had a friend whose father was a war husband. So I wonder if they ever had associations and meetings, all the war husbands that came out of the training. And then the other question, when you mentioned the people who died here at Pat Bay, and that wonderful memorial that exists at Hospital Hill on the north side. Do you know if there are many dedicated Commonwealth War planet memorials like that across the country?
Across Canada?
Across Canada, or if there's an inventory of them, because there was a lot of people died in training in a lot of areas.
Yeah. I can't answer that. I just don't know. I don't know the answer. Scott, maybe.
I can answer that question. In Ottawa, at Meadow Falls, if you know Ottawa, there are several war memorials. There's the Royal Canadian Artillery War Memorial. There is a war memorial to Canadians who participated in the Spanish Civil War. There is also a war memorial to Canadians in Hong Kong. Also to Canadian officers who were loaned to the British Army for the duration as a special program. Finally, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan War Memorial is there, with individual names and their nationalities listed on a very substantial war memorial that I think is easily just shy of 1,000 names there. And it's quite common when you go there to see that war memorial. People have put poppies or little crucifixes beside the names. So family members visit that place and put their little marker beside the name of their loved one who died in the Commonwealth training.
I'm surprised that it would be limited to 1,000. I would have thought there might be more. But anyway.
Modern preoccupation with recycling. It's notable that the Royal Canadian Armored Corps was far ahead of their time. Our Centurion tank had basically the same engine as those Lancasters. And they'd hauled a 56-ton tank 20s with.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it burned from time to time.
Well, can't be the joke to the joint.
Keith, I've rather forgotten in the interval the name of the two documentary brothers who produced a report on the Canadian forces in its various services during World War II, but their coverage of Bomber Command was highly controversial, as I recall, and it led to a series of senatorial inquiries and an attempt to rebut their findings. And, can you recall what the upshot of that debate was about, I guess it was in part the legitimacy of Canadians being involved in bombing civilians during the war. But I've rather forgotten the names of the
Terry.
McKenna. Yes, you're
Terry
right.
McKenna. One of the upshots was that the exhibit at the Canadian War Museum was actually changed. The wording of the coverage of that campaign to remove some of the really offensive wording that I think people were taking umbrage at. One of the books that Scott sent around just as a kind of background information, Gladwell's Bomber Mafia,
Yes.
deals with this question. I'm not sure it does it all that well, but it talks extensively about the differences in approach between the Americans who bombed during the day with, quote, precision bombing, and the British campaign that took place at night, which was basically carpet bombing. I think they were aiming for certain things, but they didn't much care if they got that specifically or anything within 10 miles of it. So there still remains controversy. For years and years, there was a complete absence of recognition of Bomber Command in memorials in the UK. It was only a few years ago that they actually ended up building a very impressive memorial to the Bomber Command people in London, and it's worth visiting. So it's a long-standing question, and in fact, I don't know if you know, there's the Lancaster documentary film that's going to be shown in Sydney as a fundraiser for the BC Aviation Museum on the 25th of January. It's sold out, unfortunately, but it deals with a lot of that, and it talks. One of the things they did was they talked with some of the gentlemen who'd flown these aircraft and carried out these missions, and one of the first ones said, you know, if I had been on the losing side, I would have been tried and executed as a war criminal by now. So, and these are the guys who actually did it. In the book, I made a point of saying that I can't make a judgment one way or another about that, and that's not the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to tell the individual stories. But I don't think it's an issue that will ever go away, to be honest.
Thank you.
I spent 2 years at the German War College from 86 to 88, which is in Hamburg. And that question arose many times, but I can tell you, as someone who lived in downtown Hamburg for 2 years, it would have been impossible to bomb the harbor without destroying the city. Even if you shot, I mean, in modern parlance, if we used Tomahawk missiles and decided that we would take out ships in the harbor in Hamburg, and it was the largest harbor that the Germans had control of. Rotterdam was bigger, but it was not always controlled by that. But you destroy the city because the city is around the harbor, and so. But it was a big deal, and my American classmate and I decided that we would stop taking stick from everybody, and we started calling it the North American German Urbanization Program. Because we destroyed 99% of their city, and they had to rebuild the whole thing. But I get the point about being war criminals and all that. But sometimes the targets just you couldn't hit the target without destroying the city. It just wasn't possible.
Yeah.
If I may add on to that comment, this is an extremely timely subject. I think it's small. The International Criminal Court will review South Africa and Turkey's complaint about what's going on in Gaza, and the law of armed conflict and proportionality that is involved will be a very ongoing subject. We all have views on this particular conflict, but there are legal aspects 1943, he was shot down on a raid on Kassel, Germany. We raided Kassel, Germany 3 nights in a row and burned the place down, and they lost 300,000 people in that particular area. So it just goes to show the extent of casualties gone. Now, I'd written a little memorial piece about my father and his crew. And of course, it did, living in Salt Spring at the time, and I got the inevitable person that came up, was the critic, and said, "You killed all those innocent civilians." And I said, "But you have to remember, that just about every one of them was building tank parts. They were killing our guys in the field. So it isn't all inside."
Just trying to make a note. Just as a note of interest, so this tells the American side of the story, but you may be aware, on the 26th, there's on Apple TV, there's a follow-on series to the Band of Brothers and the Pacific series that were done, and it's about the 8th Air Force campaign in Europe. And if it's anything like the previous series, it should be fairly well done. Obviously, it doesn't tell the RAF, RCAF story, but it does tell the daytime bombing campaign the Americans experienced. Just as a note. And that's on the 26th of this month, I believe, on Apple TV. I don't have stocks in Apple, by the way.
Any other questions? Okay, I'd just like to add one final point then, and that is that, and many of you may already be aware of this, but Bomber Command was specifically recognized with a bar to be attached to the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal for service in Bomber Command probably about 8 years ago, something like that. And that was to everybody in Bomber Command. It was not just aircrew, it was ground crew. Everybody who was in Bomber Command got a bar that was sent to them by Veterans Affairs Canada. And we often think bureaucracies are incompetent. Well, sometimes they are. You know,